The hallways of Westridge High School always emptied quickly after the final bell. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the loud chatter of teenagers faded away, replaced by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional squeak of rubber-soled shoes against freshly mopped floors. This was when Robert began his shift, pushing his cleaning cart from one end of the building to the other with a rhythm he had perfected over 8 years. At 42, Robert had the kind of face that carried both kindness and wisdom in its lines. His dark eyes missed nothing, and his strong hands moved with surprising grace as he emptied trash cans, wiped down surfaces, and swept away the day's mess. The blue uniform he wore had been washed so many times that it had faded to a soft shade that almost matched the pale blue walls of the school. Most of the teachers nodded politely when they passed him, but few knew his name, despite the tag that clearly read Robert pinned to his shirt pocket. To them, he was simply part of the building itself, as constant and unremarkable as the brick walls or the trophy cases that lined the main entrance. This invisibility didn't bother Robert much. He found a certain peace in his work, a satisfaction in transforming chaos back into order each evening. What no one at Westridge High knew was that the man who cleaned their classrooms had once sat in similar rooms with dreams as big as any of their students. Robert had been the first in his family to go to college, earning a partial scholarship to State University based on his exceptional math scores. His mother had cried at the acceptance letter, and his father, a factory worker for 30 years, had taken the family out for dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, a rare extravagance they could barely afford. "Math just makes sense to me," Robert had told his freshman year advisor, his eyes bright with possibility. "Numbers have a truth to them, a beauty." He had planned to become an engineer or perhaps a teacher himself, determined to reach back and pull others forward from his neighborhood. But life rarely follows the clean, predictable patterns of mathematics. During Robert's second semester, his father suffered a serious stroke. With 3 younger siblings still at home and his mother working 2 jobs to keep the family afloat, Robert had made the difficult decision to leave school and return home. Just temporarily, he'd told himself, packing up his textbooks and calculator. That temporary pause stretched into years. He found work at a local manufacturing plant, sending most of his paycheck home. By the time his youngest sister graduated high school, Robert was married with a child of his own on the way. The dream of returning to college faded with each passing year, though his love for mathematics never did. On quiet evenings, after his wife and daughter had gone to bed, Robert would often pull out old textbooks he'd kept from his brief time at university. He worked through problem sets by the dim light of their kitchen table, finding both comfort and challenge in the equations. Sometimes he'd order used math books online, teaching himself concepts far beyond what he'd learned in school. Calculus, in particular, fascinated him, the elegant dance of derivatives and integrals revealing the hidden patterns of change and accumulation in the world. Robert had been working at Westridge High for nearly a decade when his daughter, Tanya, entered as a freshman. She had inherited his aptitude for numbers, but possessed an ambition that burned even brighter than his had. "Dad, I'm going to be an astrophysicist," she announced one evening when she was 12, and Robert had no doubt she would manage it. He took extra shifts and odd jobs on weekends to start saving for her college fund, determined that her path would not be interrupted as his had been. Having Tanya at the school changed things for Robert. He began paying closer attention to the teaching styles of different math instructors, sometimes lingering outside classroom doors after hours, listening to the approaches they used to explain concepts. He would then adapt these methods when helping Tanya with her homework. "How do you know all this stuff, Dad?" she asked one evening as he walked her through a particularly tricky algebra problem. Robert smiled. "I picked up a few things along the way." That was an understatement. What had begun as a way to keep his mind sharp had evolved into a serious study of advanced mathematics. Through free online courses and second-hand textbooks, Robert had taught himself college-level calculus, linear algebra, and even some differential equations. The beauty of these abstract systems provided an escape from the monotony of his daily work, a private world where his mind could soar beyond the constraints of his circumstances. At school, Robert took special care with the classrooms where math was taught. He studied the problems left on whiteboards, sometimes noticing small errors in the teacher's work that he would quietly erase and correct before morning. It was a small, secret pleasure, being the unseen hand that guided things toward accuracy. Mr. Phillips was the advanced placement calculus teacher, a younger man with a reputation for brilliance but impatience. Robert had observed how students both respected and feared him. Phillips had high standards and made no effort to hide his disappointment when students failed to meet them. His classroom was the last one Robert cleaned each night, partly because he enjoyed examining the complex problems that often remained on the board. One Thursday evening in late October, Robert was emptying the trash in Phillips's room when he noticed the teacher still at his desk, staring frustratedly at a stack of student papers. "These kids," Phillips muttered, not really addressing Robert but simply venting to the air. "I've explained this concept 3 different ways and they're still not getting it." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "It's not even that complicated." Robert kept his eyes down, continuing his work silently as he had learned to do when teachers were present. But he couldn't help glancing at the paper Phillips was marking. It contained a problem involving integration by parts, a technique Robert had studied extensively the previous winter. "Sorry about that," Phillips said suddenly, seeming to remember Robert's presence. "Don't mean to complain. It's just been a long day." "No problem, sir," Robert replied quietly. Phillips gathered his things and left, but the problem stayed in Robert's mind as he finished cleaning the room. The solution was clear to him, elegant even, though he could see why students might struggle with it. Their approach was too mechanical, missing the intuitive understanding that made the technique powerful. After completing his shift, Robert headed home through the crisp autumn air, thinking about his daughter who would be taking Phillips' class in a few years. Would she face the same frustrations? Would she receive the support she needed to truly grasp these beautiful ideas? The bus was nearly empty at this hour. Robert took a seat near the back, pulled out a small notebook he always carried, and began sketching out different approaches to the integration problem. By the time he reached his stop, he had worked out 3 distinct ways to explain the concept, each building on different intuitive foundations. The modest apartment where Robert lived with his wife, Lisa, and Tanya was warm and filled with the smell of cooking when he arrived home. Lisa worked as a nurse at the local hospital, often taking night shifts so they could save on childcare costs when Tanya was younger. Tonight she was home stirring something on the stove that made Robert's stomach growl appreciatively. "How was work?" she asked, accepting his kiss on her cheek. "Same as always," he replied with a small smile. He never burdened his family with the smaller indignities of being invisible, of being treated as part of the furniture. Instead, he shared the moments of quiet satisfaction, the gleam of a freshly polished floor, the order restored to a chaotic classroom. As they ate dinner, Tanya chatted excitedly about her science project and the upcoming math competition she had entered. Her enthusiasm reminded Robert of himself at that age, before life's complications had narrowed his path. Later that night, after helping Tanya with her homework and spending time with Lisa, Robert returned to his notebook. The integration problem from Phillips's class still lingered in his mind. There was something profoundly satisfying about working through mathematical challenges, a clarity that was often missing from the messier aspects of life. Little did Robert know that the next day would bring a moment that would shatter his carefully maintained invisibility and change the trajectory of his life at Westridge High. The man who had spent years in the background was about to step reluctantly into the light, all because of a thoughtless prank and the unexpected revelation of a talent kept hidden for far too long. The following day started like any other for Robert. He arrived at the school before sunrise to handle the heavier cleaning tasks before students filled the hallways. The early morning quiet was something he treasured, just him and the empty building, the gentle hum of his floor polisher creating a soothing rhythm as he worked. By the time the first bell rang, Robert had already retreated to the maintenance room, organizing supplies and preparing for his evening shift. Throughout the day, he moved through the building handling minor issues, a clogged toilet in the boys' bathroom, a spill in the cafeteria, a broken desk in room 203. Most students rushed past him without a glance, their minds occupied with tests and social dramas and whatever urgent messages buzzed on their phones. A few of the kinder ones nodded hello. Tanya, his daughter, always stopped to chat briefly when their paths crossed, though she had explained that some of her friends thought it was weird that her dad worked at the school. "Let them think what they want," Robert had told her with a gentle smile. No shame in honest work. Around 2 o'clock, Robert was replacing light bulbs in the hallway outside Mr. Phillips's classroom when he heard the teacher's voice rising in frustration. The door was partially open, and Robert couldn't help glancing inside as he worked on the nearby fixture. Phillips was at the whiteboard, marker in hand, working through what appeared to be a complex integration problem. "This is why we spent 3 days on integration by parts," Phillips was saying, underlining a portion of the equation with sharp, irritated strokes. "This isn't some new concept I'm throwing at you. We've been building toward this for weeks." Robert could see the blank looks on many of the students' faces. A few were frantically taking notes, while others had clearly given up following the explanation. One boy in the back row was staring out the window, completely disconnected from the lesson. Phillips sighed heavily. "Let's try this one more time." As the teacher began explaining again, Robert paused in his work, listening carefully to the approach. The problem involved integrating a product of functions where one grew rapidly while the other oscillated. Phillips's method was sound, but he was missing a trick that would make the solution more elegant. Robert had encountered similar problems in his self-study, and there was a substitution technique that simplified things considerably. He lingered longer than he should have, absorbed in the mathematics, until he realized Phillips had noticed him hovering in the doorway. The teacher gave him an odd look, and Robert quickly returned to changing bulbs, embarrassed to have been caught eavesdropping. Later that afternoon, as Robert was emptying trash cans in the teacher's lounge, he overheard Phillips talking about the same calculus class. Several teachers were gathered around the coffee machine, unwinding after school hours. "I swear this might be the most challenging group I've ever taught," Phillips was saying, rubbing his temples. "There's this one integration problem. It's not even that difficult, but they're looking at me like I'm speaking ancient Greek." "Maybe you're just too smart for them." "Phillips," joked Mrs. Chen, the chemistry teacher. "Not everyone has your math brain." Phillips laughed half-heartedly. "Trust me, this isn't advanced stuff. This is basic calculus they'll need for any STEM field in college." Robert kept his head down as he worked, moving quietly around the edges of the room, invisible as usual. He had nearly finished when Mr. Thompson walked in. Thompson taught American history and coached the basketball team. He was loud and well-liked by students, but had a reputation among the custodial staff for being dismissive, the type who would create a mess and assume someone else would clean it up. "Still going on about your math geniuses?" Thompson asked, slapping Phillips on the shoulder as he reached for the coffee pot. "They're not getting it, and I don't know how to explain it any simpler," Phillips replied. Thompson glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Robert as he emptied the last trash bin. A smirk crossed his face. "Hey, I've got an idea," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to say something they think is clever. "Why don't we ask the janitor to solve it? That'll show the kids how easy it really is." A few of the teachers chuckled uncomfortably. Mrs. Chen frowned slightly but said nothing. Phillips looked embarrassed but then seemed to get caught up in the moment. "You know what, that's not a bad idea," he said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "A little shock might be just what they need." Robert felt his stomach tighten. He'd experienced moments like this before, times when people assumed his job defined his intelligence, his worth, his entire identity. Usually he let these moments pass, holding his dignity in silence. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was because of the hours he'd spent the night before thinking about this very problem, or maybe it was knowing his daughter would someday sit in Phillips's classroom. Thompson was already walking toward him, still wearing that smug grin. "Hey there, he glanced at Robert's name tag. "Robert, we need your help with something." Robert straightened up, his face carefully neutral. "Yes, sir?" "Mr. Phillips here has a little math problem his students can't figure out. We thought maybe you could take a crack at it. Show them anybody can do it." Thompson's tone made it clear he expected either confusion or embarrassment from Robert, either of which would provide the punchline to his joke. By now, all the teachers in the lounge were watching. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, a few seemed eager for the coming humiliation. Phillips had moved to the whiteboard at the end of the room, uncapped a marker, and began writing out the problem, the same one Robert had heard him struggling to teach earlier. The equation filled a good portion of the board, an integration problem that required careful handling of trigonometric functions nested within exponential terms. Robert recognized it immediately. including the spot where most students likely got stuck. "There you go," Phillips said, holding out the marker to Robert with a slightly challenging look. "Integration by parts. Think you can solve it?" The room fell quiet. Robert could feel every eye on him, the weight of their assumptions, their prejudgments. He thought about walking away, about muttering some excuse and returning to his cleaning cart. That would be easier, safer. But then he thought of Tanya, of how she might one day face her own moments of being underestimated. What would he want her to do? Would he want her to shrink away or to stand in her truth? Robert set down his trash bag and wiped his hands on his uniform. Then he stepped forward and took the marker from Phillips. "I can try," he said quietly. The silence in the room deepened, now tinged with anticipation. Thompson leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a smile playing at his lips as he waited for the janitor to stumble and give up. Robert studied the problem for a moment, though he didn't need to. He already knew multiple approaches to solve it. The question was which one to use, which one would be clearest. Not just mathematically, but as a statement about who he was and what assumptions these people had been making about him. He decided on the most elegant solution, the one that revealed the hidden symmetry in the problem. Taking a deep breath, Robert began to write. His hand moved confidently across the board, the marker squeaking slightly as he laid out the steps in a clear, methodical sequence. He started with the standard integration by parts formula, but then introduced a substitution that simplified the expression dramatically. Years of self-study flowed through him as he manipulated the equation, his mind several steps ahead of his writing. As he worked, Robert began to speak, quietly at first, and then with growing confidence. "If we look at the structure of this problem, we can see there's a pattern here that suggests a particular approach," he explained, circling a portion of the equation. "Instead of applying the formula mechanically, we can recognize that this substitution transforms our integral into a more manageable form." The room had gone completely still. The smirk had vanished from Thompson's face, replaced by open-mouthed surprise. Phillips was staring at the board, following Robert's work with growing astonishment. Mrs. Chen had set down her coffee mug and was watching with intense interest. Robert continued, walking through each step of the solution, explaining his reasoning in clear, simple terms, the kind of explanation he wished he could have heard as a student, the kind he used when helping Tanya with her homework. When he reached the final answer, he underlined it twice and then added a note showing an alternative approach. "You could also solve it this way," he said, quickly sketching out a second method. "It's less direct, but it might help students see the connection to earlier concepts." He capped the marker and turned to face the group of teachers. Their expressions ranged from shock to embarrassment to genuine admiration. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Phillips cleared his throat. That's exactly right," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Both approaches. But the first one, I've never seen the problem solved quite that way before." Robert handed the marker back to him. "It's just a different perspective," he said simply. "Sometimes looking at things from another angle helps." Without waiting for a response, he picked up his trash bag and headed toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of their stares on his back, knew that everything had just changed, though he wasn't yet sure how. As he pushed his cart down the hallway, away from the teacher's lounge, Robert thought about what he had just done. For 8 years he had been invisible in these halls. Now in the span of 5 minutes he had made himself seen. Whether that was a mistake or an opportunity remained to be discovered. Robert tried to return to his normal routine the next day. He arrived early, focused on his tasks, and did his best to blend back into the background of Westridge High. But something had shifted. He could feel it in the way teachers looked at him in the hallways, the double takes and whispered conversations that stopped when he approached. Word traveled quickly in high schools, even when the subject wasn't a 16-year-old's dramatic breakup or the football team's chances at state championships. By morning, most of the faculty knew what had happened in the teacher's lounge. By lunchtime, the story had reached the students. Robert was mopping the hallway outside the cafeteria when he first noticed a group of kids staring at him. They weren't being subtle about it, pointing and whispering behind their hands. One of them, a boy Robert recognized from AP Calculus, broke away from the group and approached him somewhat nervously. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, clutching a notebook. Are you the janitor who solved Mr. Phillips's impossible calculus problem? Robert paused, leaning slightly on his mop. I wouldn't call it impossible, he said carefully. The boy's eyes widened. So it is true. He fumbled with his notebook, flipping pages until he found what he was looking for. I've been stuck on this for days, and Mr. Phillips said it was just a matter of practice. But I still can't figure out where I'm going wrong. He held out the notebook, showing a problem set with several abandoned attempts at a solution. For a moment, Robert hesitated. This wasn't part of his job. He had responsibilities, schedules to keep, a routine that had defined his place in this school for years. And yet, let me see, he said, wiping his hands on his uniform before accepting the notebook. The problem was a related rates question involving a ladder sliding down a wall. Robert quickly spotted where the boy had gone wrong, a common error in setting up the relationship between the variables. You've got the basic idea, Robert said, pointing to the work. But look here, when you set up your derivative, you need to be careful about what's changing with respect to time. He explained the concept in simple terms, using the concrete image of the ladder to help illustrate the abstract mathematics. The boy listened intently, nodding as understanding dawned on his face. That makes so much more sense, he said, taking back the notebook. Mr. Phillips never explained it like that. More students had gathered at a slight distance, watching the exchange with curious eyes. The boy turned to them and nodded, which seemed to be some kind of signal. 2 more students approached, their own homework in hand. Would you mind looking at this one too? Before Robert could answer, Mr. Phillips himself rounded the corner. He stopped abruptly at the sight of the small cluster of his students gathered around the janitor. For a second, Robert thought he saw annoyance flash across the teacher's face, but it was quickly replaced by something more complicated. Perhaps embarrassment. Perhaps curiosity. Taylor, Phillips called to the first boy. You're going to be late for your next class. The students scattered, but not before Taylor whispered a quick thanks to Robert. Phillips lingered, watching the students hurry away before turning his attention to the janitor. Got a minute? He asked, not quite meeting Robert's eyes. Robert nodded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear whatever the teacher had to say. Yesterday's incident had already disrupted his carefully maintained anonymity more than he'd wanted. Phillips cleared his throat. About yesterday, that was inappropriate. What Thompson did, what I went along with, it was disrespectful. Robert kept his expression neutral. No harm done. Actually, Phillips continued, I think there was harm. We made assumptions about you based on your job. That was wrong. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. What you did with that problem was impressive. Not just solving it, but the approach you took, it was elegant. More elegant than how I've been teaching it. Robert shifted uncomfortably under the praise. I've always enjoyed math, he said simply. Where did you learn calculus at that level? Phillips asked. I mean, that wasn't just basic understanding. You were teaching concepts I'd expect from someone with advanced training. For a moment, Robert considered giving a vague answer, something that would end the conversation quickly and allow him to return to his work. But there was genuine curiosity in Phillips' question, free from the condescension that had characterized their previous interactions. I started college, Robert replied. Couldn't finish. But I kept studying on my own. Library books, online courses when those became available, just learning what interested me. Phillips nodded slowly. Self-taught, he murmured, almost to himself. Then, more clearly, have you ever thought about teaching? You have a way of explaining concepts that seems to click with students. Robert almost laughed. Not many schools hiring janitors as math teachers. No, Phillips agreed. But maybe they should be. He seemed about to say something else when his phone buzzed. He checked it quickly. I need to go, but I'd like to continue this conversation sometime if you're willing. As Phillips walked away, Robert returned to his mopping, mind churning with the strange new reality he found himself in. He had spent years being practically invisible in these hallways. Now suddenly people were seeing him, really seeing him. It was unsettling. By the end of the school day, Robert was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. Every task had been interrupted by curious looks, tentative approaches, whispered conversations that fell silent when he got too close. It felt like being under a microscope, his carefully constructed routine disrupted by this newfound attention. When he arrived home that evening, Lisa noticed his distraction immediately. Rough day? She asked as he sank into a kitchen chair. Strange day, he corrected, then told her what had happened. Lisa listened without interrupting, her expressive eyes widening at points in the story. When he finished, she sat silent for a moment, thinking. So they know now, she said finally. They know who you really are. Robert shook his head. They know one thing about me. That's all. It's a start, Lisa replied. She reached across the table and took his hand. Robert, you've been hiding your light for so long. Maybe this is a good thing. I'm not hiding, he protested. I'm just doing my job. You're doing a job, Lisa corrected gently. But it's not who you are. Before Robert could respond, Tanya burst through the front door, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her face alight with excitement. Dad, she exclaimed. Everyone at school is talking about you. Jessie said her brother is in AP Calculus, and he said you solved some problem none of the students could figure out. And even Mr. Phillips was shocked. And is it true? Robert sighed. He should have known Tanya would hear about it. It got blown out of proportion, he said, so it is true. Tanya dropped her backpack and sat down at the table. Dad, this is huge. Tell me everything. Despite his discomfort, Robert couldn't help but smile at his daughter's enthusiasm. He recounted the story again, trying to downplay the significance, but Tanya wasn't having it. This is what I've been saying all along, she said, turning to her mother. Dad's the smartest person I know. Now everyone else is figuring it out too. The next morning, Robert arrived at school to find Dr. Wilson, the principal, waiting for him in the maintenance office. Dr. Wilson was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for running a tight ship. In 8 years, she and Robert had exchanged perhaps a dozen words, all of them brief and professional. Mr. Johnson, she said, using his last name for the first time Robert could remember. I'd like to speak with you in my office when you have a moment. Robert followed her through the quiet pre-bell hallways, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Was he in trouble for the incident in the teacher's lounge? For helping the students with their homework? For stepping outside the boundaries of his position? Dr. Wilson's office was neat and practical, with student artwork framed on one wall and academic achievement certificates on another. She gestured for him to sit in one of the chairs facing her desk. Mr. Phillips came to see me yesterday afternoon, she began without preamble. He told me about what happened in the teacher's lounge, about your impressive mathematical abilities. Robert nodded but said nothing. He also mentioned that several students approached you for help with their calculus homework, and that you were able to explain concepts in a way they found very accessible. She folded her hands on her desk. Is that correct? I just showed one student where he went wrong with a problem, Robert said. It wasn't a big deal. Dr. Wilson studied him for a moment. Mr. Johnson, we have students struggling with mathematics at all levels. We have a tutoring program, but it's overwhelmed. Mr. Phillips believes you have a natural talent for teaching these concepts. She paused. Would you be interested in helping out with our after-school math tutoring program? We could adjust your hours to accommodate it, and of course you would be paid for your time. Robert stared at her, caught completely off guard by the offer. You want me to tutor students in math? Mr. Phillips was quite insistent that your understanding of calculus is exceptional, Dr. Wilson said. And we need all the help we can get. Think about it, please. Let me know by the end of the week. As Robert left her office, he felt like he had stepped into someone else's life. 24 hours ago, he had been just the janitor, someone who cleaned up messes, fixed broken things, maintained the background of school life. Now, suddenly, he was being asked to teach. The bell rang and students began filling the hallways. Several of them noticed him, nudging their friends and pointing. Robert heard whispers. That's him? And the math genius janitor, as he made his way back to the maintenance office. He wasn't sure how he felt about this sudden visibility, this unexpected recognition. Part of him wanted to retreat, to return to the comfortable anonymity of his routine. But another part, a part that had been dormant for too long, felt a spark of something that might have been pride, or purpose, or possibility. As he gathered his cleaning supplies to start the day's work, Robert thought about Dr. Wilson's offer, about the students who had looked at him yesterday with new eyes, about Tanya's pride when she learned what had happened. Maybe Lisa was right. Maybe this was a good thing after all. Robert accepted Dr. Wilson's offer to join the after-school tutoring program. His schedule was adjusted so he could start his custodial work earlier in the day and finish in time for the 3 o'clock tutoring sessions. The arrangement meant longer days and earlier mornings, but Robert found himself looking forward to the challenge in a way he hadn't felt in years. The tutoring program operated in the school library, with different subject areas designated by tables. On his first day, Robert arrived 5 minutes early, uncomfortable in his fresh uniform, feeling out of place despite Dr. Wilson's assurances that he belonged there. The other tutors, mostly teachers and a few senior students earning community service hours, glanced at him with undisguised curiosity. Mr. Phillips approached, offering a hand to shake. "Thanks for doing this," he said. "We've got a waiting list of students who specifically requested you." Robert raised his eyebrows. "Requested me?" Phillips nodded. "Word gets around fast. Let me show you to your table." The math tutoring area was marked with a small sign. Several students were already waiting, notebooks open and calculators ready. Robert recognized a few from AP Calculus, including Taylor, the first student who had approached him in the hallway. "Our math genius is here," one of the students said, not unkindly. Robert shook his head. "Not a genius," he corrected. "Just someone who enjoys math and wants to help. Now what are we working on today?" That first session was awkward at times. Robert hadn't taught in any formal capacity before, and the students weren't quite sure how to interact with someone they'd previously known only as the man who cleaned their classrooms. But mathematics provided a common language, a neutral ground where titles and positions fell away in the face of problems that needed solving. By the end of the 2-hour session, Robert had helped 6 students work through difficulties with calculus concepts, explained integration techniques to a confused sophomore, and even assisted a junior with advanced algebra. The students thanked him as they left, and Robert felt a deep satisfaction he hadn't experienced in a long time. "That went well," Phillips said, stopping by as Robert gathered his things. "You have a knack for this." Robert shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's easier to understand something when someone explains it in different ways. Sometimes all it takes is finding the right approach for each person. That's exactly what makes a good teacher," Phillips replied. Over the next few weeks, a new routine emerged. Robert arrived at school before dawn, completed most of his custodial duties by early afternoon, and then spent 2 hours in the tutoring program. Word continued to spread, and his math table became the most popular in the library, often with students waiting their turn for his help. The dynamic at Westridge High shifted subtly. Teachers who had previously barely acknowledged Robert now greeted him in the hallways. Students waved when they saw him. Mr. Thompson, who had started the whole situation with his prank, avoided Robert entirely, clearly embarrassed by his role in the incident. Most surprising was how the students treated him. There was a new respect in their interactions, but they also seemed more comfortable around him. They asked questions not just about math, but about life decisions, about college, about careers. Robert found himself drawing on his own experiences, both the successes and the detours, to offer perspective. "Did you always want to be a janitor?" A senior named Carlos asked one afternoon as Robert helped him with a particularly tricky calculus problem. The question was asked innocently, without malice, but it still gave Robert pause. "No," he answered honestly. "I wanted to be an engineer. Life took me in a different direction." "But you know more math than most of my teachers," Carlos said, confusion evident in his voice. "Why didn't you become a math teacher instead?" It was a question Robert had asked himself many times over the years. Sometimes we make choices based on what we need in the moment, not what we want in the long run, he explained. "I had family responsibilities, bills to pay. The timing wasn't right for more education." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "So you just gave up on it?" The word stung more than Robert expected. "I wouldn't call it giving up," he said carefully. "I found different ways to keep learning, different ways to use what I know." "Like now," Carlos said, gesturing to the math problems spread before them. "Like now," Robert agreed. That conversation stayed with Robert for days afterward. Had he given up on his dreams? Or had he simply adapted to the circumstances life had presented? The distinction felt important somehow, a subtle reframing that shifted how he viewed his own story. At home, the changes were noticeable too. Robert found himself more engaged, more energetic despite the longer hours. He spoke more about his day, sharing stories of breakthrough moments with students. Tanya began bringing her friends around more often, proudly introducing them to her dad, no longer self-conscious about his position at the school. "My dad's practically famous now," she told them, only half joking. "Everyone wants his help with math." Lisa noticed the change in her husband as well. "You seem happier," she said one night as they sat on the couch after Tanya had gone to bed. "More like the man I met all those years ago." Robert considered this. "I feel useful in a different way," he admitted. "Cleaning is important work. Someone has to do it, and I've never been ashamed of it. But this tutoring, it's using a part of me that's been dormant for too long. Maybe it's time to think about what comes next," Lisa suggested gently. "You've got options now that you didn't have before." "Options?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "Dr. Wilson clearly values your abilities. The students love you. You could talk to her about more formal teaching opportunities. Maybe finish your degree." The idea seemed so far-fetched that Robert almost dismissed it immediately, and yet a small part of him wondered, what if? As November turned to December, Robert's reputation continued to grow. What had started as a novelty, the janitor who could solve complex calculus problems, evolved into genuine respect for his teaching abilities. Even some of the regular teachers began consulting with him about how to explain difficult concepts to struggling students. One Tuesday afternoon, about a month after Robert had started tutoring, Dr. Wilson visited the library during a session. She observed quietly from a distance as Robert worked with a group of students, explaining a concept about rates of change using everyday examples that made the abstract mathematics concrete and relatable. When the students dispersed, she approached him. "You've made quite an impact," she said. "I've had parents calling to specifically request their children work with you." Robert felt a mix of pride and embarrassment. "I'm just trying to help." "You're doing more than that," Dr. Wilson replied. "You're inspiring them." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "Mr. Johnson, I'd like to speak with you about something. Would you have time to meet in my office tomorrow morning?" Robert agreed, curious and slightly apprehensive about what the principal wanted to discuss. The next morning he arrived at her office at the appointed time, still in his maintenance uniform as he had come straight from his early tasks. Dr. Wilson wasn't alone. Beside her desk sat a well-dressed man Robert didn't recognize, who stood and offered his hand as Robert entered. "This is Dean Lewis from the local community college," Dr. Wilson explained after introductions were made. "I asked him to join us because I think there's an opportunity here that might interest you." Robert took a seat, trying to hide his confusion. "Dr. Wilson has told me about your mathematical abilities and your success with the tutoring program," Dean Lewis said. "We're always looking for talented instructors, especially for our evening classes. Many of our students are working adults who appreciate practical approaches to complex subjects." Robert looked between them, not quite comprehending. "Are you offering me a job?" "Not exactly," Dean Lewis clarified. "At least not yet. We'd need you to have at least an associate's degree, but we have an accelerated program for working adults with prior college credits." Dr. Wilson mentioned you had started college. 1 year, Robert confirmed. "A long time ago." "Those credits might still transfer," Dean Lewis said. "With an accelerated program, you could complete your associate's degree in mathematics in about a year, taking evening classes. We offer scholarships for promising candidates, especially those with demonstrated teaching abilities." Robert sat in stunned silence as they outlined a possible path forward, continuing his work at Westridge while taking evening classes, earning his degree, and potentially transitioning to teaching math at the college level. It was as if they were describing someone else's life, a parallel universe where his old dreams hadn't been deferred. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why go to all this trouble for me?" Dr. Wilson leaned forward. "Because talent shouldn't be wasted," she said simply. "And because you've shown in just a few weeks what can happen when students connect with someone who can make difficult concepts understandable." "I don't know what to say," Robert admitted. "You don't have to decide right now," Dean Lewis assured him. "Take some time. Talk it over with your family. The spring semester starts in January, so you have a few weeks to consider it." As Robert left the office, his mind was racing with possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider in decades. The practical part of him immediately thought of obstacles, the cost, the time commitment, the risk of change. But another part, the part that had come alive again in the past month, could see a door opening to a future he had long ago filed away as impossible. When he returned to his maintenance tasks, the familiar routines felt different somehow. As he moved through the hallways with his cart, he found himself looking at the school not just as his workplace but as a place of transformation. For the students, yes, but perhaps for him as well. Later that day, during the tutoring session, a student asked him about a particularly challenging problem. As Robert guided her through it step by step, watching the moment of understanding dawn on her face, he realized something important. Regardless of his job title or the uniform he wore, this was who he truly was. Someone who could bridge the gap between confusion and clarity. Someone who could open doors for others through the universal language of mathematics. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to open a few doors for himself as well. That evening, Robert sat at the kitchen table with Lisa and Tanya, explaining the unexpected meeting with Dr. Wilson and Dean Lewis. He laid out the opportunity as it had been presented to him, the accelerated degree program, the scholarship possibilities, the potential to teach at the community college upon completion. "I don't know," he said, running a hand over his face. "It's a big change. A lot of risk." Lisa reached across the table and took his hand. "What are you really afraid of, Robert?" He was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. "Failing," he finally admitted. "Starting down this path and not being able to finish again." He looked down at his work-worn hands. "I'm 42 years old. I haven't been in a classroom as a student in over 20 years. Dad," Tanya said, her voice firm despite her youth, "I've seen you learn new things all the time. You taught yourself calculus from old textbooks and YouTube videos. You're already teaching other people. The only difference would be a piece of paper saying what we already know." "It's more complicated than that," Robert began. "Is it?" Lisa asked. "Or are you just scared to want something again? To admit that you've been dreaming about this all along?" Robert looked at his wife and daughter, their faces full of a certainty he couldn't quite feel himself. "What about money? My job, our routine?" "We'd figure it out," Lisa said. "We always do." "And think about it, Dad," Tanya added, excitement building in her voice. "You could be a real teacher, with a desk and everything." Despite his anxiety, Robert smiled at her enthusiasm. "A desk, huh? That's the big draw?" "You know what I mean?" she said, rolling her eyes in that particular teenage way. "People would call you Professor Johnson instead of asking you to fix their toilet." The comment hit harder than Tanya probably intended. There was nothing wrong with fixing toilets. Honest work was honest work. But Robert couldn't deny the appeal of being valued for his mind rather than his hands. Later that night, after Tanya had gone to bed, Robert and Lisa continued the conversation. They talked about practical matters, finances, schedules, childcare, but also about deeper things, hopes long deferred, the example they wanted to set for their daughter, the question of what Robert truly wanted from the second half of his life. "I keep thinking about something my father told me," Robert said quietly. "He said that sometimes a man doesn't get to do what he loves, but he does what he must to take care of his family. That's what I've been doing all these years." "Your father was right about doing what you must," Lisa replied. "But he was wrong if he meant you have to choose between what you love and taking care of your family. Sometimes the path is longer and windier than we expect, but that doesn't mean we should stop walking it." By morning, Robert had made his decision. The next 2 years unfolded in a whirlwind of activity and change. Robert enrolled in the accelerated program at the community college, attending evening classes 3 nights a week after finishing his duties at Westridge High. His prior credits transferred, giving him a head start, and the scholarship covered most of his tuition. Still, the transition wasn't easy. The first semester was particularly challenging. Robert struggled to relearn how to be a student, taking notes, studying for exams, writing papers. There were moments of doubt when he questioned whether he had made the right choice, whether he was foolish to think he could reinvent himself at his age. What kept him going were the small victories, acing his first calculus exam, helping younger classmates understand difficult concepts, receiving encouragement from professors who recognized his natural teaching abilities. And always there was the support of his family. Lisa taking on extra nursing shifts to ease their financial burden, Tanya helping around the house without complaint, both of them creating the quiet space he needed for studying. At Westridge, Robert continued his custodial work during the day and his tutoring sessions in the afternoons. The schedule was grueling, leaving little time for rest or recreation, but there was a purpose to his exhaustion that made it bearable. He was no longer just maintaining the status quo. He was building toward something new. As word of his journey spread throughout the school, Robert found himself the recipient of unexpected support. Teachers offered to help him study for exams. Students created a quiet workspace for him in a corner of the library. Even Mr. Thompson, who had started the whole chain of events with his thoughtless prank, approached Robert one day with an awkward apology. "I judged you based on your job," Thompson admitted. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Robert accepted the apology with grace, recognizing that it represented a shift in thinking that went beyond one person's mistake. "We all have more to us than what people see at first glance," he replied. In the spring of his second year in the program, Robert received an offer that accelerated his plans even further. The school district, impressed by his success with the tutoring program and aware of his progress toward his degree, proposed a new position: mathematics teaching assistant. The role would allow him to work alongside certified teachers in the classroom while completing his education, with a pathway to full certification through an alternative teaching program. It meant leaving behind his custodial position, the stable job that had supported his family for years. It meant stepping fully into a new identity, one that had been glimpsed but never fully embraced. It meant taking another risk. Robert accepted the offer. On a warm day in May, Robert Johnson stood in his cap and gown, associate's degree in hand, surrounded by family and friends. Lisa and Tanya beamed with pride. Several teachers from Westridge had come to witness the moment, as had a handful of students whose lives he had touched through tutoring. Dr. Wilson was there too, her presence a reminder of how far he had come since that day in the teacher's lounge, when a prank had unexpectedly changed the course of his life. "How does it feel?" Lisa asked as they celebrated afterward. Robert thought about the question. "Like the end of one journey and the beginning of another," he said finally. The following September, Robert walked into Westridge High not as a janitor, but as a mathematics teaching assistant. The hallways he had once cleaned were now the paths to classrooms where he would help shape young minds. His first assignment was to assist in Mr. Phillips's AP Calculus class, the very class where his hidden talents had first been revealed. As students filed in that first day, some recognized him from his custodial days or his tutoring sessions. Others were new faces, unaware of his unusual path to the front of the classroom. Robert felt their curious eyes on him as he stood beside Mr. Phillips, who introduced him with genuine respect and enthusiasm. "Mr. Johnson will be working with us this year," Phillips explained. "He's one of the most talented mathematics instructors I've ever encountered, and you're fortunate to have the benefit of his insights." There was no mention of Robert's former position, no hint of the circumstances that had brought him to this point. He was simply Mr. Johnson now, an educator worthy of their respect. As the semester progressed, Robert settled into his new role with a natural ease that surprised even himself. The skills he had honed through years of self-study and months of tutoring translated well to the formal classroom setting. His practical approach to mathematics, connecting abstract concepts to real-world applications, resonated with students who had previously struggled with the subject. By winter break, Robert had become an integral part of the mathematics department. He continued his own education in the evenings, now working toward a bachelor's degree, with the ultimate goal of full teacher certification. The path ahead was still long, but for the first time in decades, Robert felt completely aligned with his purpose. One afternoon, as he was preparing materials for the next day's lesson, Tanya stopped by his classroom after school. She had started her junior year at Westridge and was taking pre-calculus, not with her father, as they had both agreed that might be awkward, but with another teacher in the department. "How's it going, Mr. Johnson?" she asked with a grin, deliberately using his professional title. Robert smiled. "Better than I ever imagined, Ms. Johnson." Tanya's expression grew serious. "You know, Dad, I was thinking about something. Remember when that teacher tried to embarrass you by making you solve that calculus problem? He thought he knew exactly who you were based on your job." Robert nodded. "People see what they expect to see," he said. "But that's just it," Tanya continued. "He wasn't entirely wrong. You are a janitor who knows calculus. You're also a father, a husband, a student, and now a teacher. The mistake wasn't in thinking you could be one thing. It was in thinking you could only be one thing. Robert looked at his daughter, struck by the wisdom in her words. When did you get so smart? She shrugged. I had a pretty good teacher at home. As Tanya left, Robert turned back to his lesson plans, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought about the Robert Johnson of 2 years ago, the man who moved quietly through these same hallways, invisible to most, his talents and dreams hidden beneath the uniform of his circumstances. That man hadn't disappeared. He still valued the dignity of all work, still took pride in a job well done, still believed in the importance of maintaining the spaces where learning happened. But he had expanded beyond the limits that others had placed on him, and perhaps more importantly, beyond the limits he had placed on himself. Outside his classroom window, Robert could see students crossing the courtyard, their futures still unwritten. He wondered how many of them carried hidden depths, unexpected talents, dreams deferred by circumstance or discouraged by others' low expectations. He couldn't change the system overnight, couldn't erase the prejudices that led people to make assumptions based on a uniform or a job title, but he could be living proof that those assumptions were often wrong. He could be the teacher who looked beyond the surface, who encouraged students to embrace all parts of themselves. He could be the reminder that it's never too late to become more fully who you are. And that, Robert decided as he turned back to his work, was a lesson worth teaching.